Your mother just plays in the dirt for drill weekend pocket change. You girls need to look up to someone who actually built a real career." My 14-year-old daughter repeated those exact words to me, staring intently at the kitchen floor. The man who originally said them was her father, my ex-husband, a senior technology executive who viewed my Army National Guard uniform as a pathetic excuse for a low-income hobby. To understand how I let a 2-star general dismantle his entire arrogant reality in front of a massive military formation, I have to go back. How does a man who measures power purely by his corporate salary react when he is forced to measure it in federal armor and human lives? My name is Sarah. I am 37 years old, and for the last 15 years, I have navigated 2 entirely different worlds. Monday through Friday, I work as a civilian supply chain manager for a large manufacturing firm in Michigan. It is a demanding, predictable career built on logistics and vendor contracts. But my true profession, the one that defines the absolute core of my identity, is my service as a combat engineer officer in the United States Army. Most people fundamentally misunderstand the National Guard. They hear the title and picture local volunteers handing out bottled water during a heavy storm. That domestic mission is a real and vital part of the job. But the other part requires the exact same training, the exact same lethal standards, and the exact same overseas combat deployments as the active duty military. We simply carry that burden while balancing civilian careers and motherhood on the outside. In the Engineer Corps, our entire operational doctrine revolves around pressure and stability. We clear heavily fortified minefields. We calculate the precise volume of high explosives required to breach a reinforced concrete barrier. You do not act on emotion in my line of work. A miscalculation costs human lives. Because of that, you learn to identify structural weaknesses long before a collapse happens. You rely on cold, hard math. 5 years ago, the structural integrity of my marriage failed completely. My ex-husband, Richard, did not leave because of a massive, dramatic betrayal. We simply grew into 2 entirely different people. I valued service, quiet duty, and raising our 2 daughters with a strong moral compass. Richard valued aggressive upward mobility, performative wealth, and absolute corporate dominance. He was a senior vice president at a major software firm, and he viewed every human interaction as a hostile takeover. When the divorce was finalized, we agreed to joint custody of our girls, who were then 9 and 5. I kept the modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. Richard immediately purchased a sprawling, custom-built estate in a highly exclusive, gated community. For the first 2 years, we managed a fragile, workable peace. But as the girls grew older, Richard realized he was losing absolute control over their worldview. He wanted them to value status and money above all else. When a wealthy, arrogant man feels his influence slipping, he usually reaches for his checkbook. Richard began a quiet, calculated campaign to buy my daughters away from my reality. If you have ever had your quiet dedication completely dismissed by someone who only respects a massive bank account, you know the exact kind of frustration I am talking about. It is an incredibly isolating feeling. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to bite your tongue while someone arrogantly judged your life. Because my military service was in the Guard, Richard completely misunderstood it. He looked at a standard civilian pay chart, saw what a junior officer made for a 2-day drill weekend, and decided my military career was a pathetic, low-income hobby. He did not know about my combat deployment to the Middle East. He did not care about the staggering weight of federal property I managed, or the nights I stayed awake writing tactical operations orders for my soldiers. He just saw a mother in a faded sedan who occasionally missed out on lucrative weekend networking events. Therefore, he started weaponizing his wealth to paint me as a neglectful, part-time mother. He began buying the girls wildly extravagant gifts, designer clothing, expensive electronics, first-class plane tickets to private resorts. I wanted my daughters to have a beautiful life, so I never complained about the gifts themselves, not because it was easy to watch them be bought over, because it absolutely hurt, but because a mother's job is to secure the perimeter, not fight over the decorations. But Richard always made sure to attach a subtle, devastating commentary to every single purchase. He would take my oldest daughter shopping for a $1,000 laptop, and he would speak just loudly enough for me to hear from the driveway during a custody handoff. He would say he was happy to step up and cover the real expenses, since my weekend camping trips barely paid enough for groceries. Weekend camping trips. That was his label for my military service. To Richard, time was only valuable if it generated a massive corporate profit. The idea that a mother would voluntarily give up her weekends, weeks, and sometimes entire years to sleep in a freezing tent and carry a rifle for government pay was completely incomprehensible to him. Because he could not process the concept of selfless service, he mocked it. Sometimes you confront a threat head-on. Sometimes you let an adversary exhaust their own supply lines. I did not argue. I focused entirely on my daughters. But overconfident antagonists always interpret silence as a lack of capability. Richard escalated his campaign. He started scheduling lavish trips to New York or Miami on the exact weekends he knew I had mandatory military drill. When I had to enforce the custody agreement and tell the girls they could not go because they had to stay at my house while I was at the armory, he expertly framed it as my fault. He told them it was a shame their mother cared more about playing soldier in the mud than letting them have premium experiences. The hardest part was watching the stress fractures form in my daughters. They started coming home from his massive estate with a creeping disrespect for our quiet life. My youngest daughter complained about having to do chores, asking why I could not just hire a housekeeping service like her father did. My 14-year-old started sighing heavily when I told her I would miss her Saturday soccer game because I had to manage a firing range. The foundation of my family was cracking under the immense weight of his financial pressure. Which brings me back to that rainy Sunday evening in late October. I had just returned from a brutal 3-day field training exercise. We had been running heavy equipment maneuvers in the freezing mud. I smelled like diesel fuel and damp wool. My boots were caked in gray clay. I was standing in my kitchen, exhausted, unpacking my heavy canvas duffel bag, when I heard his luxury car pull into my driveway for the custody handoff. My youngest daughter ran upstairs to unpack her bag, but my 14-year-old lingered in the kitchen. She did not look up. She did not offer a hug. She just dropped her expensive leather overnight bag on the floor and stared at the scuffed linoleum. She was a child standing in the crossfire of a silent war she did not understand, trying to reconcile the mother she loved with the harsh monetary judgment being drilled into her head by a man with a limitless credit card. I stopped unpacking and asked her what was wrong. She kept her eyes locked on the floor. That was when she finally spoke and delivered the devastating line about my drill weekend pocket change that stopped the breath in my lungs. She told me we needed to look up to someone who actually built a real career. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the kitchen. The rain tapped against the window pane. I looked out the window. Richard was still sitting in the driver's seat of his gleaming electric car. The tinted window was rolled down exactly 1 inch. I could clearly see the faint, arrogant smirk resting on his face. He knew exactly what my daughter was saying to me in that moment. He had planted the explosive, stepped back, and waited for the detonation. A hot, blinding rush of adrenaline flooded my chest. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to march out the front door, walk down that driveway, and drag him out by his expensive lapels. I wanted to teach him a very direct, very loud lesson about respect. The rage was a living, burning thing in my throat. The fuse was lit, and Richard was watching from his driver's seat, eagerly waiting for the explosion. But a combat engineer is trained to never detonate a charge without first calculating the exact blast radius. If I lost my temper and marched out into the freezing rain to scream at Richard in the driveway, the blast would not just hit him. It would hit my 14-year-old daughter, standing right in front of me. Richard would win the engagement. He would finally have the exact ammunition he wanted. He would paint me as a bitter, unhinged ex-wife who simply could not handle the reality of her own low income. He would use my explosive anger as concrete proof to my girls that he was the stable, superior parent. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cold, damp air of the kitchen into my lungs. I clamped down on the fury, sealing it tightly behind a heavy steel door of military discipline. "Your father is a very wealthy man," I said quietly, looking directly at my daughter. "But he and I measure a real career on two entirely different scales. Go upstairs and get unpacked. I will start making dinner." My daughter looked up, clearly surprised by the lack of an argument. She nodded hesitantly, grabbed her heavy leather bag, and walked quietly up the stairs. I turned back to the kitchen window. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with the tinted glass of the electric car in my driveway. I did not glare. I did not point a finger. I simply let the absolute silence stretch out heavy and absolute until the smug smile finally faded from Richard's face. He rolled the window up all the way, shifted into reverse, and sped off down the wet street. That night, after the girls were asleep, I sat alone at my small dining room table. The house was completely quiet except for the rain hitting the roof. I felt a deep, sickening weight settling in my chest. The structural integrity of my influence as a mother was failing, and I was rapidly running out of time to reinforce it. I needed to talk to someone who completely understood the battlefield. I did not need a family law attorney because this was not a legal dispute over custody hours. This was a battle for my daughter's worldview, and I needed someone who knew the exact weight of a military uniform. I picked up my phone and dialed Eleanor. Eleanor was a retired colonel. She had spent 25 years navigating the most complex, high-stakes legal minefields in the Army as a judge advocate general officer. She had mentored me when I was a very young, very green lieutenant. She was a woman carved from absolute granite, completely immune to panic, and utterly disinterested in civilian corporate drama. She answered on the second ring. "Ma'am, I apologize for the late call," I said. I laid out the entire situation. I explained the wildly lavish gifts, the constant insults, the manufactured scheduling conflicts, and the devastating comment my daughter had made in the kitchen. I told her how close I had come to marching out into the rain and ripping the door off that expensive car. I confessed that I felt like I was losing my own daughters to a man whose only real qualification for leadership was a massive corporate salary. Eleanor listened in complete silence. She did not interrupt with empty sympathy. She let me bleed out the frustration until there was nothing left but a hollow, exhausted silence on the line. "You are trying to fight a heavy artillery barrage with a hunting rifle," Eleanor finally said, her voice sharp and perfectly steady. "You are letting a soft, corporate man dictate the tempo of your own life. He wants you to fight him over money because he has vastly more money than you. Therefore, you must absolutely refuse to fight him over money." "Then how do I defend my record?" I asked, staring at the dark window. "You do not defend anything," Eleanor said. "You outflank him. The man thinks you are a part-time hobbyist. He thinks you hand out sleeping bags for grocery money. He is operating on terrible, outdated intelligence. Let him keep operating on terrible intelligence. When an arrogant man is marching blindly toward a cliff, your only job is to stay out of the blast radius. She paused, letting the silence stretch across the line. You have that command selection board coming up soon, right? She asked. My stomach gave a sharp, sudden jolt. The command board. In the Army, officers do not simply receive promotions based on how many years they have managed to survive. We compete for command slots through intense, highly secretive evaluation boards. Your entire record is laid bare. Every evaluation report, every physical fitness test, and every tactical decision you have ever made is scrutinized by a panel of senior officers who are actively looking for a reason to eliminate you. For the last 6 months, my file had been sitting at state headquarters being weighed against dozens of other highly qualified majors for a coveted combat engineer battalion command slot. A battalion command is not a standard promotion. It is a massive tectonic shift. It means taking absolute legal responsibility for hundreds of soldiers and tens of millions of dollars in federal equipment. It is the crucible that breaks average officers, and I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything in my military career. Yes, I said quietly into the phone. The results should be published any day now. Good, Eleanor said. Stop worrying about the tech executive's electric car. Focus entirely on the mission. Let the Department of the Army do the talking for you. Out here, the line clicked dead. I sat in the dark dining room, letting Eleanor's brutal logic settle deep into my bones. She was absolutely right. I had been trying to defend my honor as a mother by arguing with a man who did not speak my language. Richard did not respect quiet service duty or sacrifice. He respected raw, undeniable authority. He respected massive scale. He respected power that could be quantified and measured on a corporate spreadsheet. The next few months became a brutal exercise in tactical patience. I went to my civilian supply chain job. I went to my drill weekends. I maintained the perimeter of my life and poured my remaining energy into my daughters. The holidays approached, and Richard aggressively escalated his campaign. He bought the girls matching designer winter coats that cost more than my first car, making a massive production out of presenting them in front of his extended family. He sent me a smug, backhanded text message about it, claiming he just wanted the girls to have the kind of premium experiences I could not quite swing on my government stipend. He ended the message with a condescending suggestion that I could perhaps help pay for their expensive ski lift tickets if my budget allowed. I did not reply to the text message. I did not complain to my daughters. Not because I was afraid of an argument, because a smart commander never fights on terrain chosen by the enemy. I deleted the message, set my phone face down on the table, and went back to writing a tactical training schedule for my unit. The silence felt incredibly heavy, but it was the right move. Some battles you win with volume. Some battles you win with absolute, terrifying silence. Richard interpreted my lack of response as total surrender. He grew even more careless, completely convinced of his own superiority. He was so busy celebrating his perceived victory that he completely failed to notice the massive logistical shift happening in my own career. Then, on a dreary Tuesday morning in late November, the waiting finally ended. I had just returned home from my civilian job. I walked out to the metal mailbox at the end of my wet driveway. The sky was the color of wet iron, threatening a heavy freeze. Inside the box, buried beneath a stack of grocery store circulars and a water bill, was a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The return address simply stated, State Joint Force Headquarters, Officer Personnel Management. My heart began to hammer aggressively against my ribs. This was not a standard form letter. This was a heavy, classified, official packet. I walked back up the driveway, ignoring the freezing rain starting to spit from the clouds. I did not even take my work coat off when I walked into the kitchen. I grabbed a paring knife from the counter, sliced the heavy security tape on the envelope, and pulled out a stack of crisp, watermarked Department of the Army memorandums. I flipped past the bureaucratic cover sheets until my eyes locked onto a single, bold-faced paragraph near the bottom of the page. I reviewed the sentence 3 times to make absolutely sure I was not hallucinating. I set the heavy paper down on the kitchen counter. I stared blindly at the ticking wall clock. My lungs felt tight. A slow, profound realization began to spread through my chest, burning away months of quiet humiliation. Richard thought he was competing against a part-time mother playing in the dirt. He was about to meet the United States Army. 2 weeks after tearing open that classified envelope, I used 3 days of my civilian vacation time to drive 3 hours north to the massive state military reservation. Taking command is not a ceremonial event. It is a grueling, legally binding transfer of federal authority. I was directed to a cramped, freezing supply room tucked behind a sprawling motor pool. The outgoing commander, a battle-hardened lieutenant colonel, was waiting for me alongside his senior logistics warrant officer. They did not offer me a cup of coffee or a corporate handshake. The warrant officer simply dropped a massive, tightly bound black ledger onto the folding metal table between us. "The preliminary property book, ma'am," the warrant officer said, his breath visible in the freezing room. "You need to get comfortable with it. On the day of the ceremony next month, your signature goes at the bottom. You buy it all. When you take command in the military, you sign a primary hand receipt. By placing your name in wet ink on that document, you accept absolute, terrifying financial and legal liability for every single piece of federal gear assigned to the unit. If a private loses a radio, federal investigators get involved. If a commander loses track of an armored vehicle, their career is instantly terminated." I cracked open the heavy binder and began running my finger down the endless spreadsheet rows. The inventory of a combat engineer battalion is not just rifles and sleeping bags. We are a highly mobile, incredibly lethal construction company designed to operate directly under enemy fire. My finger traced the nomenclature and the corresponding exact dollar amounts. I was signing for massive armored earth movers machines, weighing 40 tons, designed to push through burning barricades. I was taking responsibility for tactical bridge-laying systems, massive hydraulic platforms that drop 60 feet of heavy steel across a blown river span so a column of main battle tanks can cross safely. I was accepting liability for specialized route clearance vehicles, heavily armored trucks built specifically to take a direct hit from an improvised explosive device and keep my soldiers alive. There were pages dedicated to encrypted satellite communication arrays, medical evacuation transport vehicles, and thousands of crew-served weapon systems. I saw individual line items for thermal imaging optics that cost over $40,000 apiece. I flipped to the final summary page to look at the total aggregate value. The federal government was preparing to hand me legal responsibility for equipment valued at exactly $94 million. $94 million. I sat back in the metal folding chair. The air in the freezing supply room felt suddenly thin. I stared at that massive, uncompromising number, and then my mind flashed back to my rainy kitchen. I thought about Richard, sitting behind the wheel of his imported electric car, looking at me through a tinted window with a smug, patronizing smirk. I thought about the expensive designer coats he had weaponized to buy my daughter's loyalty. I thought about his constant bragging about closing $3 million software contracts and his absolute certainty that my life was nothing more than a pathetic, low-income hobby. He had built his entire worldview around the illusion of immense corporate dominance. He genuinely believed that because I drove a faded sedan and wore a uniform on the weekends, I was a small, irrelevant, part-time mother. A profound, dangerous calm washed over me. The anger that had burned in my chest for months completely evaporated. This was the structural turn. I realized I did not need to scream at Richard in the driveway. I did not need to drag my daughters into a toxic text message war defending my honor. I did not need to explain this promotion to him or beg for validation as a mother. I had the ultimate, undeniable proof of my reality sitting right in front of me, printed in black and white on an official federal ledger. I just needed the right venue to let the absolute weight of the facts crush his narrative. When a military unit transitions to a new commander, the Army does not handle it quietly. We execute a change of command ceremony. It is a rigid, deeply historical tradition designed to publicly formalize the transfer of total authority. It requires a vast parade field, a brass band, and the physical presence of the highest-ranking generals in the state. The event exists to prove to the soldiers exactly who holds their lives in their hands. It is massive. It is highly structured. And it is completely immune to corporate spin. Most incoming commanders use their guest list to invite their proud parents, spouses, and closest friends. I had a completely different strategic objective in mind. I drove back to my suburban house that evening and sat down at my quiet dining room table. The division protocol office had handed me a stack of pristine, heavy cardstock invitations, all stamped with the gold castle insignia of the military engineers. I took out my favorite black fountain pen. I addressed envelopes to my parents, my sister, and to Eleanor. Then I slid a blank, cream-colored envelope to the center of the table. I took a slow breath to steady my hand. I did not just put my daughter's names on the card. I deliberately wrote Richard's full name in thick black ink, formally inviting him to attend. I kept the enclosed handwritten note incredibly brief and entirely neutral. I did not mention the word battalion. I did not explain the sheer size of the military base where the event would take place. I simply asked him to bring the girls to a family milestone. I knew exactly how a man like Richard would process that heavy piece of paper. His towering arrogance was a perfectly predictable machine. He would look at a military invitation from his ex-wife and instantly picture a pathetic, poorly funded gathering. He would imagine himself driving to a run-down armory behind a strip mall, sitting on a rusted folding chair, and watching me receive a cheap plastic certificate from a bored state bureaucrat. He would interpret the invitation as my desperate, pathetic attempt to earn his respect. He would see it as a golden opportunity to dress in an expensive tailored suit, patronize my efforts in front of our daughters, and prove once and for all that he was the only successful parent. I walked outside into the freezing Michigan night. I walked to the corner and dropped the heavy gold-stamped envelope into the blue postal collection box. The metal door clanged shut, a sharp sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. I had laid the charges perfectly in the open. Now I just had to wait and see if his ego was massive enough to trigger the blast. The reply to my formal invitation did not arrive on the heavy return card I had carefully provided. It came exactly 4 days later in the form of a bright, deeply patronizing text message sent directly to my personal phone while I was sitting at my civilian supply chain desk. The message from Richard read, quote, "Got the invite for your military thing. The girls are dreading giving up their Saturday, but I told them it is important to support your weekend projects. I rescheduled a few major corporate strategy meetings so we can swing by. Let me know if you need me to cover the cost of a celebration pizza afterward." Unquote. Your weekend projects. I read the glowing screen twice. A lesser officer might have immediately fired back a furious response to that blinding condescension. But a combat engineer knows that sheer arrogance is the easiest way to ensure an adversary ignores all the warning signs of an impending collapse. Richard had taken the bait flawlessly. He had constructed a completely fictional narrative based entirely on his own massive superiority complex. He truly believed he was executing a grand charitable favor by agreeing to endure an hour of amateur pageantry in a dusty local gym. His offer to buy pizza was the perfect final insult, a clear message to my daughters that he had the vast financial resources to rescue them from their mother's poorly funded hobby. I did not feel angry. I felt an absolute icy calm. I typed back a brief message confirming the arrival time, hit send, and immediately turned my attention back to my civilian work. For the next 4 weeks, my civilian life essentially became a ghost. Assuming command of a combat engineer battalion requires terrifying logistical precision. During the day, I managed civilian vendor contracts, but every single night, and entirely through the weekends, I was fully submerged in the crushing reality of taking federal authority over hundreds of soldiers. You do not simply show up, put on a dress uniform, and take the flag. The transition requires a massive, agonizing process called a 100% joint inventory. The outgoing commander and I spent weeks crawling across freezing motor pools and standing inside heavily vaulted supply cages. I had to physically lay my hands on, verify the serial numbers of, and officially document a massive portion of the $94 million in equipment I was about to own. I spent hours climbing into the armored cabs of heavy construction vehicles to inspect encrypted radio mounts. I counted highly sensitive thermal optics locked behind heavy steel mesh doors. I reviewed the tactical readiness files for over 500 soldiers spread across armories across the entire state. I was operating on 3 hours of sleep a night, driven entirely by the crushing weight of the mission. The gap between my reality and my ex-husband's delusion was rapidly expanding into a canyon. Richard, sensing the date was approaching and wanting to reinforce his absolute dominance, decided to strike one more blow. He wanted to intercept my daughter's attention before they could even step foot in my world. Therefore, he casually offered to take them to a premium Broadway touring show in Chicago for that exact Saturday afternoon. My 14-year-old daughter called me on a Tuesday evening, sounding incredibly hesitant. She said they would probably just skip my military event to go to the play, since her father had told them my ceremony was just going to be a boring weekend chore anyway. I felt a sharp, immediate spike of adrenaline. Richard was actively trying to ensure they never witnessed the truth. But a commander does not surrender the battlefield. I kept my voice completely steady. I told my daughter that I loved her very much, that this was a deeply important day for our family, and that I fully expected her and her sister to be there. I told her the Broadway show would still be touring next year. 15 minutes later, my phone vibrated with another text from Richard. Quote, "Relax, Sarah. We will be there." The girls were just getting anxious about sitting on metal folding chairs in some local high school gym for 2 hours. I told them I will buy them an incredibly expensive dinner downtown afterward to make up for the lost weekend. Unquote. Some local high school gym. I smiled slightly, locked the screen of my cell phone, and went back to polishing the brass on my dress blue uniform jacket. The morning of the ceremony arrived, cold and violently clear. The Michigan sky was a deep, piercing blue. The event was not being held behind a strip mall. It was taking place at the primary state military reservation. This is a massive, highly fortified federal training base that spans over 100,000 acres of dense timber, artillery ranges, and armored maneuver areas. I arrived before the sun came up. The base was already vibrating with heavy activity. A combat engineer battalion is physically massive. The sheer volume of the heavy vehicles demands immense space. Therefore, the ceremony was scheduled for the primary parade field, an expanse of perfectly manicured grass the size of 3 football fields. My soldiers were already shifting into position. Heavy tactical supply trucks were grinding across the pavement to form a massive steel backdrop. The state military band was actively tuning their brass instruments near the grandstand. The air smelled of freezing wind, hot diesel exhaust, and absolute discipline. I stood near the edge of the parade field, wearing my crisp dress uniform, watching my executive officer organize the massive formation. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, A luxury electric sports utility vehicle approached the main entrance of the military installation. I obviously could not hear the conversation happening inside the vehicle from my position, but my 14-year-old daughter later told me exactly how the drive went. Richard had spent the entire trip making condescending jokes. He complained bitterly about the rough, rural roads leading toward the base. He joked that they should have stopped to buy a folding table so they could help run my bake sale. He loudly tapped his expensive watch, reminding the girls they had dinner reservations at a high-end steakhouse later. He was entirely expecting to pull up to a rusted chain-link fence park in a muddy gravel lot and sit in a dusty, poorly lit gymnasium. Instead, the vehicle was directed off the civilian highway onto a massive, multi-lane military access road. As they rounded the final curve toward the main gate, the easy banter inside the vehicle died instantly. The entrance to the installation was a hardened federal security checkpoint. Heavily armed military police in tactical body armor stepped out from behind massive concrete pillars to stop the vehicle. Heavy steel anti-ram barriers loomed just past the guard shack, designed to stop a speeding truck dead in its tracks. According to my daughter, Richard became completely silent as the young military police officer approached his driver's side window. Richard rolled down the tinted glass and attempted to make a smooth, familiar corporate joke about the delay, but the military police officer simply stared back, totally unamused. He demanded federal identification from every adult in the vehicle. The sheer, silent menace of the security checkpoint completely froze the words in my ex-husband's throat. The officer ran their names against a highly restricted visitor access roster. The military does not care about the sticker price of a luxury vehicle or the brand of a tailored suit. After a tense, heavy minute, the officer handed the identification cards back and sternly pointed toward the parade field. The luxury vehicle rolled slowly through the massive steel gates. My daughter told me that was the exact moment the condescending jokes stopped forever. As they drove deeper into the installation, the reality of my world finally breached the hull of Richard's arrogance. They passed endless rows of heavy artillery pieces parked in secure motor pools. They passed marching formations of soldiers chanting cadence in the freezing air. They passed a flight line where 3 massive military transport helicopters were actively running their engines, shaking the ground with a terrifying rhythmic thumping. Richard finally followed the temporary signboards and pulled into the designated visitor lot. He stepped out of his vehicle and adjusted his expensive gray suit, desperately attempting to project his usual aura of corporate dominance. But as he looked past the tree line, he was completely unprepared for the staggering sight of heavy armor looming just across the grass. A young female first lieutenant wearing an immaculate dress blue uniform and perfectly white gloves stepped sharply off the curb as the luxury electric vehicle came to a complete stop in the designated distinguished guest parking area. She did not offer a casual corporate greeting. She did not smile. She snapped a crisp, rigid salute, addressed Richard strictly as a civilian guest, and informed my daughters she was their designated protocol escort. Richard remained completely silent as the lieutenant led them away from the asphalt parking lot. He was still desperately expecting to find a dusty armory floor, a rusted folding chair, and a cheap plastic trophy. But as they crested a small grassy rise, the true immense scale of the event hit him like a physical shockwave. The lieutenant led them to an elevated, heavily reinforced grandstand draped in thick red, white, and blue bunting. Dozens of senior military officers, state officials, and local dignitaries were already seated, wearing full dress uniforms covered in ribbons and medals. The protocol officer guided Richard and my 2 daughters to a set of reserved chairs in the absolute center of the very front row. As Richard sat down, the smug, aggressive posture he had weaponized against me for 5 long years completely evaporated. The grandstand overlooked the primary parade field, a massive expanse of manicured grass the size of 3 football fields. Arranged directly behind the field, in a terrifying, imposing line, was the heavy armor. Dozens of 40-ton armored earth movers, tactical bridge-laying vehicles, and heavy transport trucks sat perfectly aligned. The cold morning sun reflected sharply off their massive, reinforced steel blades. It was a visual wall of absolute, uncompromising military power. And directly in front of that heavy armor stood the Combat Engineer Battalion. Over 500 soldiers were formed up in massive, rigid blocks. They were standing at absolute silent attention. They wore pristine uniforms and held polished rifles, projecting an aura of lethal, terrifying discipline. The sheer volume of troops created a wall of human force that stretched out endlessly across the grass. Richard stared blankly at the massive formation. My 14-year-old daughter, sitting right next to him, gripped the metal railing of the grandstand. Her eyes were wide, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the scene before her. Then the state military band struck up the heavy, booming notes of the adjutant's call. I marched out from the right side of the parade field alongside the outgoing commander and the 2-star major general who commanded our entire division. We moved in perfect synchronized steps, our polished boots striking the pavement in absolute unison, halting exactly in the center of the vast open grass. I kept my eyes locked strictly on the horizon. A combat commander does not break bearing. But I knew exactly what was happening in the grandstand. The brigade adjutant stepped up to a microphone. The military does not deal in vague corporate platitudes or soft suggestions. The transfer of command is a terrifying federal mandate, and the official orders must be announced aloud, permanently entering the historical record. "Attention to orders!" the adjutant barked. The massive block of soldiers snapped their heels together in a single deafening crack that echoed across the field like a gunshot. Richard physically jumped in his padded seat. The adjutant began reading the official narrative. His voice boomed across the massive public address system, completely dominating the open air. He detailed the exact operational scope of the mission. He stated clearly that this Combat Engineer Battalion was a high-priority strategic asset prepared for rapid deployment to hostile overseas theaters. He explicitly detailed the $94 million in federal assets and heavy armored equipment assigned to the command structure. He did not call it drill weekend pocket change. He called it absolute staggering federal authority. Then the 2-star general moved to the podium. He did not deliver a generic, polite speech. He leaned into the microphone and spoke directly about the terrifying burden of command. He spoke about the immense sacrifice required of an officer who must balance a demanding civilian career and motherhood with the terrifying weight of leading a federal engineer battalion. "Command is not a given right," the general thundered, his deep voice ringing clearly across the silent field. "It is a heavy, absolute burden earned through total dedication. The woman standing before you today has been selected because the Department of the Army trusts her with its most lethal assets, and vastly more importantly, with the lives of its sons and daughters. We expect her to lead from the front, and she has never failed that standard." Every single word the general spoke was a massive, undeniable artillery strike against the false narrative Richard had so carefully constructed. A public correction of the facts became a total, devastating collapse of his entire arrogant reality. My 14-year-old daughter turned her head slowly and looked directly at her father. She finally realized that the wealthy man sitting next to her, the man who had bought her expensive designer coats and mocked my faded sedan, had been operating on terrible intelligence. He had tried for years to convince her that her mother was a small, irrelevant part-time parent who played in the dirt for grocery money. She was now staring at the absolute, undeniable opposite of that lie. The general stepped back from the microphone. The outgoing commander took the heavy gold-fringed battalion colors from the command sergeant major. He passed the heavy flag to the general. The general turned and passed the massive wooden staff directly to me. In that single physical motion, the absolute authority of the Combat Engineer Battalion transferred fully to my shoulders. I grasped the heavy staff. I passed the flag back to the command sergeant major. A massive, echoing boom rolled across the field as the ceremonial artillery cannon fired a blank round, violently shaking the metal floorboards of the grandstand. I stepped forward and issued my very first verbal command to the massive formation. "Battalion, present arms!" My voice echoed across the vast field. The unified metallic crack of hundreds of rifles snapping into place was absolutely deafening. In that final moment, as the thick, white smoke from the artillery round drifted across the cold blue sky, I finally allowed myself to turn my head just slightly. I locked eyes with Richard. He was staring back at me from the front row of the VIP grandstand. His face was entirely pale. The smug, aggressive corporate arrogance he usually carried was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization. He was a man who only measured power in corporate titles and designer labels. In that moment, staring at the sheer physical force of a United States Army Combat Engineer Battalion, he finally realized how thoroughly he had underestimated the quiet mother in the faded sedan. The military band struck up the official division march. The massive formation turned and marched off the field in perfectly synchronized columns, the ground shaking deeply under the combined weight of their heavy boots. Following the ceremony, the brigade protocol officer directed all the civilian guests toward a large, heavily heated reception tent set up near the edge of the parade field. I stood near the entrance in the traditional receiving line, alongside my executive officer and my senior non-commissioned officers. A battalion commander does not retreat to a quiet corner. You stand your ground, and you look the people who support your soldiers directly in the eye. Richard approached the line very slowly, trailing several feet behind my two daughters. The aggressive corporate stride he normally used to intimidate people in boardrooms was completely absent. He looked deeply uncomfortable, glancing nervously at the senior officers and heavily decorated sergeants milling around the massive tent. My daughters broke away from him and ran directly to me. My 14-year-old daughter did not mention the drill weekend pocket change. She did not mention the expensive Broadway tickets or the steak dinner Richard had promised her to make up for this boring chore. She reached me and threw her arms tightly around my waist, burying her face into the heavy wool of my dress blue uniform jacket. She looked up at me with profound, unspoken awe. "That was terrifying, Mom," she said quietly, her voice full of absolute respect. "And it was amazing. I am so glad you came," I told her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Are you hungry? I have a feeling the supply sergeant ordered entirely too much food." She nodded, a massive, unburdened smile breaking across her face. Then Richard finally stepped forward. He reached out a hand. His grip, usually an aggressive squeeze meant to instantly establish dominance, was incredibly hesitant and weak. He attempted a tight, deeply uncomfortable smile. "Well," Richard muttered, completely unable to meet my eyes. "Quite an operation you have out here. I have to admit I had absolutely no idea you were running something of this magnitude. It is quite a logistical footprint for a weekend." It was a stuttering, desperate, backpedaling compliment. He was actively trying to reestablish the dynamic where he was the senior executive, offering polite approval to a junior employee. He desperately wanted me to agree with him, to smooth over his massive miscalculation, to give him a way to save face in front of the girls. A weaker officer might have gloated. A lesser mother might have loudly brought up the expensive designer coats, the luxury vacations, and the constant snide comments about my grocery money. I could have completely humiliated him in front of my own soldiers. I could have verbally destroyed him right there on the grass. But a true commander does not punch down. A true leader does not waste ammunition on a thoroughly defeated adversary. I gave his hand a brief, firm shake, and immediately released it. "It is not an operation, Richard," I said, my voice completely flat and perfectly calm. "It is the mission. Thank you for bringing the girls." I did not wait for his reply. I simply turned away from him and began shaking hands with a young sergeant who had just entered the line. I completely dismissed Richard from my reality, returning my absolute focus to the soldiers I was sworn to lead. He stood there for 2 very long, very awkward seconds, entirely disarmed by the absolute lack of conflict. He had no leverage. He had no ammunition. He could not buy his way out of the complete irrelevance he felt in that moment. He simply faded back into the crowd, completely eclipsed by the massive scale of the military world he had mocked. There was no grand courtroom victory, and there did not need to be. The consequences fell on him entirely through the undeniable exposure of the absolute truth. In the years that followed, the dynamic shifted permanently. Richard stopped buying extravagant gifts specifically designed to buy my daughter's loyalty. He completely stopped making snide comments about my drill weekends. He learned very quickly that a parent's true worth is not defined by the size of their bank account, but by the massive weight of the responsibility they are willing to carry for others. My girls never again asked when I was going to get a real career. My 14-year-old even asked me to help her start running on the weekends to prepare for her high school track team. She began addressing her teachers as sir and ma'am. They both found a deep, quiet pride in the reality of what their mother actually did. Performative wealth is incredibly loud, but true authority absolutely does not need to shout. It simply holds the line until the facts catch up. When someone tries to measure your entire life with their own broken corporate yardstick, you do not owe them an argument. You absolutely do not owe them a defense. You owe it to yourself to stay strictly focused on the mission. Let them march themselves straight into a wall of undeniable proof. Thank you for letting me share this story with you. If you believe that true empowerment is built on quiet duty rather than loud dollars, hit that subscribe button right now. It tells YouTube to push these stories of quiet vindication to more people who desperately need to hear them. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had to sit silently while an arrogant person completely misjudged your worth as a parent or a professional? How did you finally let the truth come out? I go through all your comments, and I deeply appreciate the support. Stay tuned, because next time I will tell you about a retired military nurse who uncovered a massive medical billing betrayal and how she used an overlooked stack of faded files to bring a powerful hospital administrator to his knees. You will not want to miss it.